You smell the laudanum before you see anything else. Sweet, medicinal, cloying. It has settled into the bedding, the pillowcases, the hair of the woman on the bed. You taste it on your own tongue when you inhale. The sheets under your hand are damp. Not from fever, from the compresses her sister has been pressing against her eyes, because the cataracts hurt and the light hurts more. Only now do you look up. The room is dark. A woman, 63 years old, partially paralyzed, nearly blind, is dying in it. 800 miles east in a Vermont safe, a file is sitting in the dark, too. A file labeled, in a man's handwriting, MTL Insanity File. It will outlive her by 9 decades, and it will one day prove what she died believing, that the verdict against her had been written before the trial began. The date is July 15th, 1882. Springfield, Illinois. Her sister Elizabeth's house, where, 40 years earlier, she had been married. It is the anniversary, 11 years to the day since her youngest son died. Sometime that evening, she collapses. By morning, she is gone. The woman dying alone is Mary Todd Lincoln, First Lady of the United States during the bloodiest war the nation had ever fought. Wife of the man most of the world calls the greatest American president. Mother of 4 boys. 3 of those boys are already in the ground. The 4th, the only one left, is not in the room. He is the one who labeled the safe. The answer to how she got here is not that she was mad. The answer is that every person she loved was taken from her, one by one, until she had only one left. And that last one took something from her, too. This is the story of a woman buried by her grief, and of the last shovel of earth thrown while she was still alive. You have heard the phrase, half-crazy Mary. Every American high school textbook contains some version of it. None of them mention that she read political philosophy in French. The story that has come down to us is this. Mary Todd Lincoln was difficult, unstable, a widow who lost her mind after the theater, a shopaholic with hysterical tendencies, a burden to her son. That is the shape she has in the museum panels and the cable channel biopics. It is not the shape she has in her own letters. The woman they called mad spoke fluent French, followed cabinet debates with the attention of a seasoned operator, and during the Civil War visited military hospitals almost daily, reading letters to wounded soldiers, writing home to their mothers, donating the entire White House liquor cabinet to field medics. Historian Jean Baker, in her 1987 W.W. Norton biography, called her one of the most politically engaged first ladies of the 19th century. The version of Mary Todd Lincoln you have been given was written by the men who broke her, and by the son who needed her silent. Before we go further, let me tell you what you are about to learn. You will learn why a sitting wartime president walked into the U.S. Capitol unannounced, in the middle of a civil war, to personally defend his wife from charges of treason before a Senate committee. You will learn what happened in a Cook County courtroom on May 19, 1875, a 3-hour trial. Mary Todd Lincoln did not know she was attending until she walked into the room. And you will learn what was written in her final will, the one line that tells you, in a single sentence, how she felt about the son who remained. Every century produces a woman punished for the wrong amount of grief. The textbook remembers the verdict. The archive remembers her. We work in the gap between those two. If that is the kind of history you want, where the verdict comes before the evidence and the evidence sits in a safe for 90 years, subscribe. To understand the bedroom in Springfield, you have to start in another bedroom. 32 years earlier, Springfield, Illinois. February 1850. Edward Eddie Baker Lincoln, second son of Mary and Abraham, is 3 years old. He has been sick for 52 days. When Eddie dies, Mary collapses. Abraham writes that she is inconsolable. She will not look at Eddie's small clothes folded in the drawer. She gives them to a servant. This will become a pattern. Months later, she delivers another son, William Wallace Lincoln, Willie. She writes to a friend that the new child has almost saved my reason. The first shovel of earth had fallen. She did not yet know how many more would come. March 1861. Mary Lincoln arrives at the White House. She is 42, speaks French, and has chosen to follow her husband into politics with her whole self. She will be hated for all of it. The Eastern establishment sees her as a crude Westerner. The Kentucky aristocracy sees her as a traitor. Southern newspapers call her a race mixer. Northern newspapers call her a spy, because here is what history rarely mentions. Of Mary Todd Lincoln's 13 full and half siblings, according to historian Stuart W. Sanders and the American Battlefield Trust, 8 supported the Confederacy. Her half-brothers Alexander, David, and Samuel served in the Confederate Army. Her half-sister Emily was married to a Confederate general. Her favorite brother, Alexander Alec Todd, wore Confederate gray. And she lived in the White House. She supported her husband and the Union without wavering. She visited wounded Union soldiers in Washington hospitals almost daily, reading letters, bringing flowers, writing to their mothers. The Northern press did not care. In early 1862, a secret committee of the United States Senate opened an investigation into the First Lady's loyalty. And then something happened that had never happened before in American history. The president, in the middle of a civil war, walked into the Capitol unannounced and stood in front of the committee himself. According to Senator Orville Browning's account, cited in Ishbel Ross's The President's Wife, Putnam, 1973, Abraham Lincoln said, roughly, "I appear of my own volition before this committee to say that I, of my own knowledge, know that it is untrue that any of my family hold treasonable communication with the enemy." The committee dissolved. The investigation ended. A sitting wartime president had gone to Congress to defend his wife from charges of treason, and she had not yet lost her second son. February 1862. The White House. Willie Lincoln, 11 years old, falls ill with what is almost certainly typhoid. Contracted, historians believe, from the contaminated Potomac River water that ran through the White House plumbing. For 3 weeks, Mary barely sleeps. Her younger son, Tad, is sick with the same fever in the next room. No one knows if Tad will live. On February 20th, Willie dies. Abraham Lincoln walks into Mary's room. According to Elizabeth Keckley's 1868 memoir, Behind the Scenes, he said, "My boy is gone. He is actually gone." Mary begins to weep. She does not stop for weeks. She does not attend the funeral. For 3 months, she does not leave her room. She refuses to speak Willie's name. She will not speak it again for the rest of her life. 20 years of silence about the child she once called the most beautiful and dearest of my boys. Keckley records one of the most terrible moments in any First Lady's biography. Abraham Lincoln, at his wit's end, took Mary to a window overlooking Washington. He pointed at an asylum on the hill across the river, and he said, "Try and control your grief, or it will drive you mad, and we may have to send you there." 13 years later, that exact fate would come for her, but not from a stranger's hand. While Mary grieved in the White House, her brothers were dying on battlefields she was not allowed to mention. Samuel Todd, Confederate half-brother, mortally wounded at Shiloh, April 1862. Alexander Alec Todd, her favorite brother, killed at Baton Rouge that August. Mary cannot mourn Alec publicly. In private, she writes, in letters preserved in Justin and Linda Turner's Mary Todd Lincoln, Her Life and Letters, Knopf, 1972, that Alec's death has almost broken my heart. September 1863. Benjamin Hardin Helm, Confederate Brigadier General, Mary's brother-in-law, a man Abraham Lincoln had personally offered a Union commission, killed at Chickamauga. Senator David Davis of Illinois, Lincoln's close friend, present that day, records that Abraham Lincoln weeps like a child. And then Emily Todd Helm, Confederate widow, Mary's half-sister, comes to the White House. December 1863. In the middle of the war, to mourn. The Northern press loses its mind. General Daniel Sickles visits Lincoln to protest. Lincoln, according to Catherine Helm's The True Story of Mary, Wife of Lincoln, 1928, tells him, "My wife and I are in the habit of choosing our own guests." For 1 month, 2 sisters sat together in a private room of the White House and wept, for boys in blue and boys in gray. Outside, a country was bleeding itself to death. Inside that room, all those deaths were the same death. Mary Todd Lincoln could only grieve in the spaces where no one was watching. April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, Ford's Theater. Mary is 46. The war has ended 5 days earlier. For the first time in 4 years, she is allowed to believe the worst is behind her. She sits beside her husband in the presidential box. She is holding his hand. She will later remember whispering to him that the woman beside them might think she was being too affectionate. And that Abraham Lincoln answered. She won't think anything about it. Those are the last words she hears him speak. John Wilkes Booth enters the box. A single shot. Mary catches her husband as he slumps. The blood runs onto her dress. They carry Lincoln across the street to the Peterson boarding house. He is too tall for the bed. They lay him diagonally. Elizabeth Keckley, Mary's dressmaker and closest confidant, arrived that morning and later described in her 1868 memoir a scream that did not stop for hours. At 7:22 the next morning, Abraham Lincoln dies. Mary does not attend his funeral. She cannot rise. She remains in the White House for 5 more weeks, unable to move. That is how Washington receives the grieving widow of its martyred president. Mary leaves Washington. She takes her 2 remaining sons, Robert, 21, a Harvard graduate she has never been especially close to, and Tad, 12, the child of her heart. She and Tad travel to Europe. Distance does not help. July 15th, 1871. Chicago. Thomas Tad Lincoln, 18 years old, dies of what was probably tubercular pleurisy, a respiratory infection he contracted on the journey home from Europe. He is the 3rd son Mary has buried. She writes in a letter preserved in the Turner collection, "I feel that I have nothing left in life. She is 52. And now there is only Robert." This is the part the 1987 PBS documentary left out. And every syllabus that treats Robert Todd Lincoln as simply the Lincoln son who survived to old age, as if survival were the only relevant fact about him. Mary Todd Lincoln, a woman who had loved 4 sons, now had one. And she gave him everything that was left of her. In March 1875, while vacationing in Florida, she became convinced, without evidence, that Robert was dying in Chicago. She sent a frantic telegram to his doctor and took the next train north. When she arrived, Robert was perfectly healthy. He was alarmed not by his own condition, but by hers. Mary had begun doing things that frightened the people around her. She carried, sewn into her skirts and corsets, United States government bonds worth roughly $56,000, approximately $1.5 million in today's money. She wore them on her body, everywhere. She shopped compulsively. She believed Chicago was on fire when it was not. She took laudanum often, possibly too often. Modern historians, Jason Emerson in The Madness of Mary Lincoln, Southern Illinois University Press, 2007, and Catherine Clinton in Mrs. Lincoln, A Life, Harper, 2009, now attribute her behavior to untreated diabetes, chronic migraines, long-term laudanum use, and unresolved compound grief. Her era had only one word for all of it. That word was mad. Consider what Robert saw. His mother carried $1.5 million in government bonds sewn into her corsets. She believed Chicago was on fire when it wasn't. She took laudanum daily. She had telegraphed his doctor from Florida, certain her adult son was dying when he was perfectly healthy. A son watching a parent behave this way in 1875, with no psychiatric diagnosis available, no outpatient care, no category for what we now call compound trauma, had two honest options: warn her and risk her refusing help. Move without warning. Which option Robert chose is history. Why he chose it, fear for her, or something harder to name, is the question every historian who has read his file has had to weigh. That file is the reason we can ask the question at all. Here is what matters before we go further. The legal instrument Robert was about to use, involuntary commitment of a competent adult, followed by conservatorship of her estate, has not been abolished. American courts still approve such petitions against aging parents every year. The 1875 Chicago case is not a historical curiosity, it is the template. Robert Todd Lincoln, 31 years old, Chicago attorney, only surviving son, consulted 6 physicians in May 1875. He hired a lawyer. He prepared a case. Every document he collected, the physician letters, the witness statements, the draft of the petition, his own notes, went into a single folder. That folder would spend the next 51 years in a Vermont safe, sealed to the public, labeled in his own hand. He did not tell his mother any of this. May 19th, 1875. Chicago. This is the moment the whole story turns on. You are 56 years old. A carriage has come to your hotel on a cool May morning. You are told your son wants you to join him. You are not told where. You step down onto the sidewalk of Dearborn Street. You walk up the steps of a 4-story limestone building you have not entered before. The words Cook County Courthouse are carved above the door. You assume Robert has business here. You're led into a room. There are 17 people in it already. You do not recognize most of them. A man walks over and sits beside you. He introduces himself as Isaac Arnold and says he is your attorney. You have not hired an attorney. You have not been told you needed one. You hear the charge read aloud. The word is insanity. The petitioner named in the document is your son. You have 3 hours to understand all of this. Back to the third person. The prosecution calls 17 witnesses, doctors who had examined her briefly, store clerks, hotel employees, her own servants. Her defense attorney, Isaac Arnold, was chosen by Robert. According to the records in Mark Neely and R. Gerald McMurtry's The Insanity File, Robert's own document collection, published by Southern Illinois University Press in 1986, Arnold calls no witnesses in her defense. He performs no meaningful cross-examination. Mary sits silent. She had brought no witnesses. She did not know to prepare. The all-male jury deliberates approximately 10 minutes. The verdict, Insane. That afternoon, Mary attempts to take her own life. According to Baker's and Clinton's biographies, she goes from one Chicago pharmacy to another, ordering large doses of laudanum. A suspicious pharmacist recognizes her, refuses the order, and quietly gives her a placebo while alerting a physician. The next morning, she is taken by train to Bellevue Place Sanitarium. 1 month later, June 14, 1875, the court formally appoints Robert Todd Lincoln conservator of her estate. The woman who had carried her pension sewn into her dresses so that no one could take it from her had just had it legally taken from her by her son. This is where a tidy version of the story ends. A tragic mother, a frightened son, a 19th century medical system that did not understand grief. 6 physicians, all acting in good conscience. A verdict that was, by the standards of the era, reasonable. You could close this video here and feel you had understood. You have not. Because Robert Todd Lincoln did one thing a man acting in good conscience would not have done. He kept the file. Not with the court clerk, not with his mother's physician, in his own safe in Vermont, where it sat for 51 years after his death, until the safe was finally opened in the 1970s. A man confident in his reasons does not hide them. Bellevue was what a modern PR firm would call a luxury rehab facility, a private institution for what the 19th century called genteel women. Mary had her own room, permission to walk the manicured grounds. What mattered was that the key to the gate was not in her pocket. Within weeks, she began planning her release. She smuggled letters out. Her contact was Myra Bradwell, one of the first women admitted to the bar in American history. On August 3, 1875, Mary wrote to her, words preserved in the Bradwell papers and cited in Emerson's scholarship. Pray for me that I may be able to leave such a place as this. Through the Bradwells, through the superintendent's own logbook, which recorded Mary as rational and cooperative, through a public pressure campaign that reached the Chicago Times, the story turned against Robert. Reporters visited Bellevue. They came back saying the former First Lady seemed perfectly sane. In September 1875, after 4 months, Mary was released into her sister's custody. On June 15, 1876, a second hearing declared her restored to reason and capable to manage and control her estate. The first trial had taken 3 hours. The second took less time. But something could not be given back. Mary never forgave Robert. She moved to France, alone, in 1876. She lived there 4 years, partially blind, in constant pain from a spinal injury, in a small pension in the town of Pau. She did reconcile with Robert to a degree near the end. In May 1881, they met again. Some accounts say she softened when she held his infant daughter, a child named Mary, after her. But the wound did not close. In her final will, she did not bequeath her personal effects to her son, Robert. She left them to her grandchildren. Robert Todd Lincoln, for his part, kept the documents of the 1875 trial in a private file in the safe of his Vermont home. He labeled that file, in his own handwriting, MTL Insanity File. It was discovered only in the 1970s. It is the reason we now know, in detail, how the trial was organized. We will never fully know which motive was dominant in Robert, the fear for his mother or the desire to control what she owned. What we do know is what he did, and what he locked in a safe for the rest of his life. Mary Todd Lincoln herself never doubted. In her letters, she used only one word for what Robert had done: betrayal. July 15, 1882. back to the bedroom where we started. She had come home to her sister Elizabeth's house, where she had married Abraham Lincoln back when she was 23, and nothing terrible had yet happened. She had walked down those stairs as a bride. Now she could barely climb them. It was the anniversary. 11 years to the day since Tad died. She had written once that after Tad she had nothing left in life. The decade that followed had proved her right. Sometime that afternoon, she collapsed. By evening, she was in a coma. By the morning of July 16, 1882, she was dead. Her body was laid out in the front parlor of her sister's house, the same parlor where she had stood as a bride. Her funeral was held at the First Presbyterian Church. The mayor declared a holiday. Thousands lined the streets. For one day, the newspapers were kind. She was buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery beside her husband and 3 of her 4 sons. Robert attended. When he died in 1926, he was buried not next to his mother, but at Arlington National Cemetery. He is the only Lincoln not resting beside her. Count them in the order they fell. Eddie, 3 years old, 1850. Sam, her half-brother, 1862, Shiloh. Willie, 11 years old, 1862, typhoid. Alec, her favorite brother, 1862, Baton Rouge. Ben Helm, her brother-in-law, 1863, Chickamauga. Abraham, her husband, 1865, Ford's Theater. Tad, 18 years old, 1871, Pleurisy. 7 people. Some buried in cemeteries she could visit. Some in soil she would never see. 32 years. 7 shovels of earth. And the last one, thrown not by a disease, not by a battlefield, not by an assassin, but by the only son she had left, in a courtroom. In 3 hours. Her era called her mad. What her era did not have a word for was this: a woman handed a lifetime of losses in 2 decades, who wept exactly as much as was warranted and was punished for it by the people who should have sheltered her. The women of her century who did not weep were called cold. The women who wept were called mad. There was no correct amount of grief for Mary Todd Lincoln to feel. She was First Lady during the worst war her country had ever fought. She buried 3 children. She held her husband's hand as he was shot. She visited dying boys in hospital wards, while the newspapers called her a spy. She mourned brothers she was not allowed to name. And at the end of it, the one remaining person she had put her whole diminished heart into, put her on trial. The last shovel of earth on Mary Todd Lincoln was thrown while she still lived. It was thrown by her son,